So I'm talking about how science and utilization fits in with the architecture. I'm the chief exploration scientist for ESDMD. I do have 2 QR codes here just to point out where some of the content we're speaking about comes from. Julie went through a good bit of detail about the QR code on the right, looking at some of the documents that support our architecture concept review and leads to the release of our architecture definition documentation. But I also want to make sure you have access to the QR code to the Moon to Mars objectives, because everything we're doing over in that orange box should be showing traceability to those objectives. The punchline up front, we're looking to those objectives to help make decisions about how we build this architecture, how we implement the missions. You heard Mike talking about identifying and understanding those science objectives so we can go do that job when we implement individual missions. And then we're also making those more longer range strategic decisions about what comes next to enhance the architecture. But you should probably, if you're unaware of any of these documents, either of them or all of them, it's a great time to go ahead and start familiarizing yourself with this documentation. As Julie noted, the public piece to this, that's kind of a snapshot of our discussions, comes out around the beginning of the calendar year. So, it's a good time to start familiarizing yourself with what's already out there, understanding that some work is going on now that will update the documentation in January. Next slide, please. Now, with that in mind, I just wanted to give you a snapshot of what are the science objectives. And so we have 4 sets of those objectives listed here on the left. I won't read these in details. Again, you can access this chart deck, and I would encourage you to go to that Moon to Mars objectives QR code on the left. Lunar and planetary science, heliophysics science, human biological science, physics and physical science. And I think if you look at this in detail, and I know my science mission directorate colleagues have charts that they've shown at our ACR workshops that show the traceability of these objectives often over to the decadal surveys. So, we're not off making up new sets of objectives. We're really looking to the community documentation to help get that information translated into what we call the Moon to Mars objectives, so we can establish that traceability into the architecture and then mission implementation. So again, we'll go to the next slide. There's a set of heliophysics objectives as well. And, I guess just to point out, these are kind of high level objectives here. So the heliophysics science first objective, improve understanding of space weather phenomena to enable enhanced observation and prediction of the dynamic environment from space to the surface and at the Moon and Mars. So, that's a high level objective, and that ACR work that Julie was mentioning is going through the process of taking that and breaking that down into, what I would call actionable steps that we can take, capabilities, understanding use cases and functions so that we can go implement those. Next slide, please. We have a set for human and biological sciences, just showing those here. And then next slide, please, the physics and physical science as well. If you go to the next slide, please. Thanks, Kristen. We also have sets of what we call science enabling objectives and applied science objectives. So slightly different flavor here. But if you look at these, here's one. Actually, if you could go back to the science enabling real quick. Thanks, Kristen. Number 1, provide in-depth mission-specific science training for astronauts to enable crew to perform high priority or transformational science on the surface of the Moon and Mars and in deep space. So, there are the objectives we want to accomplish, and then there are objectives within the architecture to help ensure that we can go do that science when the time comes up. Next slide, please. And then again, applied science activities as well. So, again, I'm showing you these not to read them in detail right now, but to encourage you to go dig into some of that content, in particular in areas that you have interest. Next slide, please. Julie already showed this chart, but I felt like it was important to show it again, is that we'll have a slow buildup of these capabilities that will enable us to achieve more research as we go. That first step where we are right now, the human lunar return, this is really testing out those initial capabilities. So we've flown Artemis 1. We know that our spacecraft can fly through space and return safely. and Artemis 2 will give us the chance to fly our astronauts there. And what we'll see is a continued expansion of those capabilities through our foundational exploration, and then getting to a point where we hope that we are one of a broad set of partners who are operating on the moon as we go out into, the lesser defined sustained lunar evolution segment, because we don't know exactly what that looks like yet. So as we're going through these segments and these ACRs year after year, we're trying to help define this by making strategic decisions. One thing I do want to point out, Humans to Mars, although this is the Lunar Surface Science Workshop, we have basically a first segment to Mars, but it's not meant to be a bookend to this. It's intended to be something that can grow and expand. So that's maybe more like a human lunar return for Mars once we get out there, and that's what we kind of mean with that graphic showing kind of a deck under there of cards, because we don't know exactly what that looks like as we move forward. Next slide, please. I won't touch too heavily on these. I already made the statement that there's ever increasing capability. That capability will enable us to do more research and achieve those objectives, or at least address those objectives. So I mentioned Artemis 1 already, and Artemis 2 will be our first flight with our astronauts on board. Next slide, please. And then just to show that increasing capability, it's been mentioned already several times, but we'll build on what we've already tested and add new elements to that. We'll begin to build a gateway as we get out towards Artemis 4, and then we'll have surface mobility out towards Artemis 5 and beyond that enables us to access more area. And I did see some of the questions in there from Dean and others about, well, should we have 2 or should we have 1? And this is all part of the trade space. And what we need to do is show the traceability to the objectives, and that drives out the need that we have. So as we are learning and testing our capabilities, we probably are starting with one of these vehicles, but if the objectives drive us to multiples, then that's where we'll head. Next slide, please. And this just continues to show that expansion of capability so that we can do more research. Next slide, please. I did want to highlight that we've already flown science activities. So Artemis 1 had a series of secondary payloads we deployed as CubeSats, as well as payloads inside the Orion that taught us a lot about how we can do science going forward, as well as helping us characterize the environment within which our systems and our friends will be flying when we have astronauts on board for Artemis 2. Next slide, please. We also have payloads intended for the initial deployment of gateway elements. Again, early focus is on understanding the environment where we want to keep our systems and especially our friends safe in the environment that we're asking them to work in. So we, in partnership with our international partners, have a series of payloads that will help us understand that environment a little bit better. Next slide, please. So that's my last slide. Got the QR code here again. I encourage you to take a look at that documentation. The first step towards helping us understand the science that everyone wants to do is taking part in the architecture concept review. So as Julie talked about, we'll be engaging with the public and releasing documents and holding workshops going forward. So these are the opportunities to communicate with us if you think we're missing something or you would like to add some content to that. So please do take a look at those QR codes. In the documentation, you can find the traceability of the objectives through breaking that down into various characteristics that help us decide what to build. So that's, and understand that's where we were at the beginning of this calendar year, and significant amount of work has been going on. But please do get into that flow, that yearly cycle with us so that we can account for what you're interested in.